When it comes to fantasy settings, it's often sky's the limit when it comes to the concept of death. There's resurrections, reincarnation, undead, spirits, ghosts. Sometimes death is a mere inconvenience, sometimes there's an afterlife, sometimes it's a whole lot worse. Some of these concepts appear in Tolkien's work, but unlike many other fantasy settings, Tolkien's idea of death is fairly clearly defined. So in this video, we explore the concept of death in Tolkien's universe, and just how does it work. Before I start talking about death and how it applies to the different races and beings in Tolkien's work, it's very important to know how life actually works, and that involves understanding the following two words, Fëa and Hroa. The Fëa is the spirit or soul. This is the essence of one's being, created by Ilúvatar and coming from outside the world itself. The Hroa is the body, the vessel that allows the spirit to interact with the world around it. It's the union of these two parts that normally constitutes a living being with free will. But not all creatures have a Fëa, and not all creatures have, or at least need, a Hroa. For example, elves, men, dwarves, and ents, regarded as incarnates, all have a Fëa and a Hroa. On the other hand, animals clearly have a Hroa, but they do not have a Fëa. While they're physically alive, they're essentially automatons because they don't have a spirit. When it comes to creatures such as orcs, it's up for debate. If they were corrupted elves or men, they should have a Fëa, but if they're corrupted animals, then like animals, they're without a Fëa and don't have true free will. But what about the creatures that don't have a Hroa? Well, that would be the Ainur, the Valar, and the Maiar. They have different definitions. Instead of having a Fëa, they're regarded as Eolar. What's the difference? A Fëa needs a Hroa to be complete, whereas an Eolar is an entirely spiritual being that can exist and interact with the world without a body. Speaking of bodies, the Ainur aren't regarded as having true Hroa. That's because they could usually change their form at will, so instead they wore Fana, which directly translates to raiment. Alright, so why am I telling you all this? Trust me, if I didn't have to, I wouldn't have, because that was actually really difficult to write in a way that gets the information across in a relatively simple, concise manner. But basically, to understand death, you need to understand the limitations of the Fëa and the Hroa. Obviously, a Hroa, a body, could be destroyed. In the case of the elves, from things like injuries or grief. In the case of men, from things like disease and old age. Some Hroas are easier to destroy than others. But things are a little different when it comes to the Fëa. Unlike the Hroa, the Fëa, the spirit, is completely indestructible. Even Morgoth, who was at one point the most powerful being on Arda, never found a way to destroy a Fëa. And I've had people say in my comment sections, well, technically, a certain character isn't dead because their spirit still endures. Well, maybe in other fantasy universes, but Tolkien had a very simple definition for death, and that was the separation of the body and the spirit, whether through injury, grief, sickness, or old age. So now that we hopefully understand the definition of death in Tolkien's universe, we can perhaps talk about how it worked for each of the different races, because while the exact definition of death is the same for everyone, there are some variables in how one could get there and what happens after. I really made it sound like an adventure there. Firstly, let's talk elves, because it's the elves that we know the most about. As everyone probably already knows, elves technically don't die of old age. For example, Círdan is well over 10,000 years old by the start of the Fourth Age. But ask Galadriel about her family, and she will tell you that elves can definitely be killed. In saying that, it isn't easy. Tolkien explains that elves have a much stronger Fëa which can exert much better control over their Hroa. As a result, elves are very durable, they're immune to sickness, and can survive and heal from injuries and situations that would probably kill a man. However, this stronger Fëa does have a side effect, and that's that over time, an elf's Fëa will slowly consume their Hroa. Sounds scary, but essentially what it means is that the body of an elf would eventually fade, leaving the elf as a houseless spirit. Though this can be avoided, this is something that only happened in Middle-earth thanks to Arda-Mard, Morgoth's taint upon the world. An elf could avoid this fate by sailing west of Valinor where this wasn't a problem. And yes, this is a major reason as to why the elves were leaving Middle-earth. They can't actually stay there forever. So whether killed by a sword to the face, or whether you've consumed your own body thanks to being too stubborn to leave Middle-earth, what then happens to an elf? This is where a place called the Halls of Mandos comes into play. In an ideal situation, once killed or disembodied, an elf's Feyre would go to the Halls of Mandos, located in Valinor. They would stay there for a while, and then they would be re-embodied into an identical body by Mandos, free to spend the rest of the time in Valinor. I say ideal situation because it isn't that simple. The time spent in the Halls of Mandos could vary greatly depending on the individual. Someone such as Feanor, who was a little problematic in life, is supposed to stay there until the end of time. However, people such as Finrod and Glorfindel, who lived noble lives and then died sacrificing themselves for the good of others, were re-embodied rather quickly, and in Glorfindel's case, he was greatly empowered and returned to Middle-earth. And if someone didn't want to be re-embodied and didn't want to leave the Halls of Mandos, they could just choose to stay there. And it goes even deeper. Going to the Halls of Mandos wasn't an automatic action. Upon death, every elf is summoned there, but elves could choose to refuse those summons. Some did so because they didn't want to leave the place that they had inhabited in life, but others were tainted or had more malicious goals. For example, it's commonly theorized that Sauron's name, the Necromancer, came from him dominating elven spirits, and it's probable that creatures such as Barrow-wights were corrupted elven spirits inhabiting the corpses of dead men. As the ages progressed, it was actually becoming more common for elves to reject the summons and stay in Middle-earth. While I'm speaking of malicious elven spirits, I do want to stop and talk about one of my favourite parts of the book Nature of Middle-earth, released in 2021. In that book, Tolkien tells us that dead elves could actually attempt to possess the living, although only if a living being willingly communicated with them and offered themselves up to such a union. He says that this act of possession could potentially kill the person, or at the very least leave them badly injured. And while I'm on the topic of possession, if that sounds like the premise of Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War, where the spirit of Celebrimbor possesses Talion, a Gondorian ranger, and makes him super powerful and unkillable, while it's cool, it's still nonsense. Upon being killed, Talion would be dead, no coming back. And Tolkien also makes it clear that two Feyre can't possess the same Hroa, so it would just be Celebrimbor inhabiting a corpse, because, once again, Talion would be dead. But in saying all that, I did just replay Shadow of War. Fun game, despite the fact that it's ridiculous. And also, while I'm talking about Nature of Middle-earth, I do want to talk about one of Tolkien's insane ideas that he thankfully abandoned, and that was that instead of being re-embodied into an identical body, a dead elf would instead be reborn to different parents, and once they reached adulthood, their memories of their previous life would begin to reform. Can you imagine that for the parents? You have a child named Taronway, and then they become an adult and start telling you how they used to be Gelmir, and then recall the time that they were brutally decapitated by Morgoth's forces during the First Age. How fun, you have a child with PTSD. Anyway, regardless of whether they choose to be re-embodied or not, Elven Feyre are eternal, which means from the moment of their existence, they will stay until the end of Arthur. All the memories, the good or bad, will stay with them until the end of time. This is why elves don't actually see the gift of men as a bad thing. Speaking of the gift of men, let's talk about what happens when men die. While men and elves are biologically the same, the difference is how their Feyre interacts with their Hroa. Unlike the elves, a mannish Feyre is far less powerful and much less adapted to their Hroa. As a result, men are far less durable than elves. Men will age and inevitably die. They die from wounds sustained in battle much easier, and they can die from sickness. There are some differences between different groups of men though. For example, the Númenóreans were granted a lifespan that was anywhere between 3 to 5 times longer than that of regular men. They were far more durable, and were far more resistant to sickness. They also had the ability to willingly relinquish their lives, basically, letting go once old age was upon them. This was practiced by the earlier kings of Númenor, and it was later done by Aragorn too. But eventually, the Númenóreans abandoned this practice and would cling on to life as long as they could. This usually gave them an extra 10 to 20 years spent decrepit and senile. Yay. But what happens to men after death is a bit of a mystery. Even the Valar weren't entirely sure. The elves speculated that a man's Feyre would be summoned to the Halls of Mandos, where they would stay briefly before passing out of the circles of the world. The interpretation for this is that unlike elves, men would have a fate separate to Arda, and were able to shape their own destinies. It also meant that men had a fate separate to elves, which is why love and close friendship between the two races was a risk. In the case of the three unions of elves and men, they only worked because Luthien and Arwen became mortal, and Tuor became immortal. This was a concept known as the Gift of Men, but whereas the elves envied the gift due to the fact that it allegedly allowed men to shape their own destiny, men had an entirely different view. This was mostly thanks to Morgoth's corruption, but I think we can all agree that men in Tolkien's universe did have a point. They're around for such a short time, especially compared to elves, and unlike elves, they don't actually know what happens when they die. Unfortunately, this fear of death resulted in massive consequences. It was largely responsible for the corruption of the Númenóreans, and it led to the deaths of tens of millions of them when Númenor was destroyed. Next we have the Dwarves. We actually know very little about Dwarves when it comes to topics such as these. This is due to the fact that Dwarves aren't considered children of Ilúvatar. They didn't originally factor into his plans. They were created by Aule in secret, but as Aule did not have the ability to grant true life, they only had Hroa, not Feia. But after Ilúvatar took pity on them, he granted them Feia, and dwarves became living beings with true free will. How the dwarven Feia and Hroa interact is entirely unknown. They seem to be biologically different to both elves and men, but they take a mix of both of their characteristics. For example, like elves, dwarves are extremely durable and are completely resistant to disease, but they're not immortal. Their body does age and eventually die, although they live far longer than men. Once again, whether dwarves have powerful Feia or an indomitable Hroa is completely unknown because they're not the same as elves and men. And when a dwarf dies, we're also in the dark as to what truly happens to them, except for a very exceptional case which I'll talk about in a moment. Basically, after death, the dwarves believe that they go to a separate section of the Halls of Mandos, a section where Aule looks after them, and that after the Dagor Dagorath, the last battle, the dwarves would help Aule remake Arda. Whether these beliefs are speculation or actually true is entirely unknown. I mentioned an exceptional case where we do know what happens when a dwarf dies. I say dies with quotation marks there, and that's the case of Durin, and the fathers of the other 6 dwarven clans. While the common belief is that the 7 Durins were reborn, basically the original Durin, the Deathless, reincarnated in a new body, but Tolkien settled on the idea that there was no rebirth, and that instead, when a Durin died, after a certain amount of time, his spirit would return and the old body would awake. This creates a couple of problems, namely where the hell is Durin's body, but it's a fun idea nevertheless. While I would love to talk about Ents, we know nothing about them, so it's not really worth it. But I do want to talk about orcs, because it's a contentious issue. Even Tolkien struggled with it. As I briefly mentioned earlier, whether orcs actually had a Feia depends on their origins. If the orcs were descended from corrupted elves or men, and in some cases came from orcs that bred with men, then technically they should have a Feia. Either an elven or mannish Feia depending on the origin. In that case, if an orc died, they should share the same fate as elves or men. But in other origins, orcs were essentially corrupted animals, and because Morgoth could not grant true life, that means an orc wouldn't have a Feia. There is precedence for this, based on what Tolkien wrote. The Eagles and Huan the Hound, while clearly very intelligent, did not actually have Feia. It's possible orcs were the same, capable of being intelligent, but in reality they were just extensions of Morgoth and only existed to carry out his will. In this case, once an orc died, it would just be oblivion. The final living creatures I want to talk about is the Ainur. As I said earlier, the Ainur don't technically have a Feia and Hroa. The Ainur are Eolar, holy spiritual beings who have the ability to wear a Fana, essentially clothing. But while the Ainur don't have to adopt a physical body, many of them do for a number of reasons. The main reason was to better interact with people and the world itself, but also, due to a number of reasons, one of the Ainur could lock themselves into a form, basically becoming incarnate, much like men, elves, and dwarves. As I said, the reasons for this were varied. Morgoth and Sauron did so because they either squandered or lost their power, and therefore lost their ability to change forms. Balrogs were corrupted to the point of where they could only take the form of demons of fire. The Astari, the wizards, took the form of old men because their missions as emissaries of the Vala were secret, and therefore it was logical to take forms that didn't really draw attention. But for these Ainur, the downside of taking physical forms meant that, well, much like other incarnates, they could be killed, and being killed had serious consequences. We see this happen to Morgoth, Sauron, Gandalf, and Saruman, and in each of these cases, the end result is similar to that of a dead elf. They are left bodiless and powerless, and unable to interact with the physical world in a meaningful way. Gandalf is able to return thanks to divine intervention from Iluvatar, and Sauron is able to return thanks to most of his power being in the One Ring, effectively anchoring him to the world. I've had many people say in my comment sections, well, technically Sauron was never killed because his spirit is eternal, and to that I say, yeah, his spirit is eternal, and so is everyone else's, but that's not what death means. It means separation of body and spirit. Throughout history, this happens to Sauron 3 times, once in the downfall of Númenor, once during the War of the Last Alliance, and again during the War of the Ring. 3 times where Sauron's body is destroyed, 3 times where Sauron is killed. And while, yes, Sauron doesn't need a body, each death weakened him, and it took longer for him to reform until finally he was reduced to impotence. After his last death, Sauron is no different to a disembodied elven spirit. He has no power, he no longer has the capability to interact with the physical world. For all intents and purposes, Sauron is dead at this point. So that's how death works in Arda. It's the separation of body and spirit. Elves go to the halls of Mandos and can get a new body if they want, or they can roam around as powerless, possibly malevolent spirits. Men leave the circles of the world and have a separate fate of their own. No one truly knows what happens to dwarves, and no one knows what orcs truly even are. And even the Ainur themselves aren't immune to death. Having a physical body comes with the risk of being physically killed, and they can lose most of their power because of it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. This is one of my longer videos, and it was originally going to be longer because I planned to talk about undeath as well, but I decided at the last moment that that could be saved for a separate video because I think it does deserve its own focus. I don't have much else to say at the moment, so cheers, farewell, and remember, your fire is your brain, so try not to damage it.